Hi, this is Dan Vera. This is Fish for Fallen Light, a little poetry project in which I call up for video chat with poet and writer friends and talk about favorite poems. I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C., where it is a lovely spring day. It is April 1st, first day of National Poetry Month in the United States. I'm not sure that's international, but certainly in the United States. So it's fitting that I put up this first episode on April 1st. It's a lovely spring day here in Washington. Looking out my window, most of the trees are still bare, but the ginkgos, for one, have little spring green leafings. So anyway, this is a pretty simple project. I thought it would be fun, interesting to video chat with poets and writers about their favorite poems. This first installment features two poet friends, Sheila Black and David Campos. Sheila is, I think I spoke to Sheila she was in San Antonio, Texas, and David Campos is in Fresno, California. We are all in lockdown, but so I want to thank both of them for being in conversation with me in this way. First up is Sheila Black. The poem she chose was John Keats's last poem, and I think, as you'll see, we ended up having a great conversation about that poem, about Keats and his period, and I certainly learned a lot. So here is Sheila Black. Oh, I should say Sheila is a amazing poet and writer, has written and edited many books, and a really wonderful anthology of poetry called Beauty is a Verb. You should check it out. I'll try to leave information below this video about Sheila and David and about the poems that are featured, so you can follow along if you'd like to, or look at it later. Okay, first up, here's Sheila. Hi, Sheila.
Hi. Hi.
How are you doing?
I'm pretty good. The sun's coming out here, and it's been really cloudy for days, so I'm happy.
I think we have your cloudy and rainy weather here in DC.
It was so odd. I was hearing from DC that your weather was beautiful, and normally we have like pretty beautiful weather, and we were like 55, 45, cloudy. It was like kind of like England. It's like, well,
yeah, we've switched, so I think it's supposed to be like this until the weekend, but
it's supposed to start rising, being in the 70s and 80s, so really different. So I dressed this morning for really cloudy, but then I'm going to go put on my bright blue shirt and go out into the sun.
Excellent, great. I've had the opportunity to talk to a couple of people about their favorite poems, and I'm super psyched because there's a Keats poem that you were interested in talking about.
There is, and it's a very small poem. It's the last poem he wrote, and I've just been a Keats obsessive for years. I guess because in some ways Keats is really interesting to me because he had what would be on the surface in some ways a very tragic life. He had tuberculosis. He died at 25. He everything about him would sort of say sad romantic poet. But if you read Keats's letters and you look at his friendships and how much he packed into that life, in some ways he's this really great sort of advocate for a lust for life. And it makes it sort of doubly poignant, almost to a point of sometimes almost being unbearable when people think about Keats, that because he was a very sort of cognizant person who in some ways he was studying to be a medical student. So, you know, the minute he got TB, he kind of knew what was coming.
So
anyway,
he died of tuberculosis.
Yes. And like many people, I mean, it's sort of interesting, that kind of heightened romantic sensibility you see like in the Brontes and the Keats. Is I'm often curious how much of it comes from this kind of unimaginable to us experience of, because tuberculosis really spread through family units. Like, you know, you got it, your brother got it, your mother. You would see a lot of members of your family get sick. And there were even many symptoms of tuberculosis, like the heightened heart rate and flushed cheeks, that we associate with kind of romanticism, but it was very hard. And Keats nursed his brother and knew he stood at risk of getting it. I mean, they didn't know exactly what we know about contagion. But he sort of greeted it with this strange kind of energy. He really tried to keep writing and living right until the end. And in the end, he wrote this little poem in the margin of a book. His friends all got together. He was very beloved by his friends, actually. He had a lot of really passionate friends who were kind of like what we are, Dan, the people who kind of hang around and talk about ideas. You know, he had a like motley assortment of these kind of hipster cool friends who put together a subscription to take him to Italy, thinking maybe the Italian air, the warmth would bring him back.
Yeah.
And they sent this one friend, Severin, with him. And at the end, Keats sketched on a book that was only found, you know, really after he died. He wrote this poem called This Living Hand. And I'm going to try to recite it from memory. If I mess up, well, you can pull it up on your computer and correct me. But it's a little poem, and then I'll talk about why I love it so much.
And real quick, so the title is the first line, right? I mean, he didn't title it.
Well, he didn't title it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of known as This Living Hand. Partly because the hand is, now that we're all washing our hands a lot, this also seemed like an appropriate poem. But the title is just the first line. So the poem goes like this. This living hand, now warm and capable of earnest grasping, would, if it were cold, and in the icy silence of the tomb, so haunt thy days and dreaming nights, that thou would wish thine own heart dry of blood, that in my veins red life might flow again, and thou be conscious calmed. See, here it is. I hold it towards you. Oh, I scared I messed that up.
The only line was, so haunt thy days and chill thy dreaming nights. Yeah, lovely
line. So haunt thy days and chill my dreaming nights, that thou would wish thine own heart dry of blood, that in my veins red life might flow again, and thou be conscious calmed. See, here it is. I hold it towards you. Well, I think it's an extraordinary amount to pack into such a small poem, because he begins it almost in the future. He begins it in the present with his hand, this kind of real palpable feeling of being alive. Then he imagines this death, which we as readers, in that kind of weird dramatic irony, know, in fact, you know, he's about to experience in some ways. And there's a kind of what I like to call a messy middle to this poem, where sort of almost have this feeling of the envy and anguish of you know, this struggling against this idea of death and unfairness and mortality. And then at the end, he kind of rises up with this really amazing poetic moment. Amazing because you really feel that hand come out from the page.
Yeah.
And he kind of really reaches out and sort of says, like a shaking hands with someone, you know, here it is. I hold it towards you. We're all this one thing. And I find that unbearable, really very moving and very appropriate at a time when we've been kind of living through a long period of, I would guess, the ascendance of a kind of social Darwinism in America that's ultimately been very destructive to us in some ways. But when we think of our history, even though Whitman and Keats are very different poets, I've been thinking about how I read a little snippet about Whitman recently where they were talking about how his experience of the war and his brother's experience of the war really shaped him as a poet toward this idea of universal love or charity or reaching out. And I think that Keats wants us to see that struggle in the middle. I mean, because it's certainly what he goes through. But, you know, it's that ability to kind of admit it and push through it that I find extraordinary. Mm-hmm. And another, you know, it's an extraordinary moment in poetry. And it's also a real example of, in some ways, Keats had this idea of negative capability that was hugely influential. And one thing I like about Keats is that from what we know of him, he was someone, well, I'll go back a little bit. Keats was a Cockney. So if he had read that poem, he would have probably read it in a Cockney accent, which we don't think of when we think of Keats.
Yeah, that's interesting.
You know, we don't think like, this living and now warm and capable. We don't think of him as urban Londoner who actually working class.
Right.
And he was working class. His dad began as a stable hand and was ambitious and smart, I guess, and worked his way up to sort of ownership of a stable in the East End, then was kicked in the head by a horse and died when they were children. And the mother was so grief-stricken and may have already been ill with TB, which might have contributed, but basically disappeared and went and wandered the streets for a few years. So the children were kind of left alone. And Keats was kind of adopted by a wealthy neighbor or patron, became his patron. And the guy, you know, helped the family by making sure he got into medical school, which was middle class. I mean, doctors weren't then what they are now. I mean, in the sense of rich and ultimately respected, but it was definitely a step up. Keats was, of course, medium interested in being a doctor, much more interested in being a poet, but came from this real working class. Like his mom had basically been homeless for a few years. During that time, the older brother became ill, and basically the family died, you know, his brother Tom, and then one of his brothers immigrated to the States and went to Kentucky and then to Idaho, I believe. So in some respects, Keats was a new thing in poetry. And I think we've talked about this before, but the vehement criticism of what was seen as the raggedness and inaccuracy of some of Keats's poems, you know, when he in the famous one where he talks about seeing Cortez on the distant isle, and he gets the geography wrong. I mean, there was this sort of a weird idea that Keats was this upstart, like he would kind of command mythology in ways that weren't necessarily strictly accurate. He was wildly inventive. There was a real like difference in class there. And he also, but one of the things I like about him, to get back to the present, is he was part of a group of young people from mixed backgrounds talking about art. It's sort of when you start to see this kind of bohemian world kind of emerge. So he comes up with this idea of negative capability when he's out drinking with his friends, and they all have this big discussion about what makes a good artist. And Keats says it's the ability to rest in doubts and uncertainties without any irritable striving after fact or reason. And what he's seen, and poets have, you know, really dwelt on this idea has come to stand for a lot of different things. Everything from a radical suspension of what you know in order to find out something new, to defamiliarization, to just the ability to invent something and let it play out as far as it'll go. You know? But certainly we see a little bit of that in this living hand, in that sort of imaginative leap of the hand's alive, it could be dead, it's a lot, you know, it goes back and forth. Similarly to Ode on a Grecian Urn, where, you know, Keats acts as if the figures on the urn are kind of suspended for eternity in the state of being almost alive, like very interested in worrying those boundaries between me and you, death and life. Like kind of like the romantic poet Novalis, who said, I am not I am you. That kind of, how hard do I take that boundary? And that's one reason I like that poem.
Do you remember the first time you came across it?
Yeah, I would have been in high school, actually, because I was a terrible student. And in my senior year, it's so funny, the difference between the 70s and now. I hate to go digress, but back then there was a certain pride in being like a really bad grades, but you read a lot, whatever. And you can still get into college. I feel really kind of bad for kids today because I feel like a lot more is demanded of them. But I had been a pretty bad student, and this old teacher, Dr. Gregory, who had been taught in some college or other, maybe in Columbia, came and taught in my high school, and he taught a class on Shakespeare. And he said, oh, if you like Shakespeare, and I actually, for the very first time in my whole high school career, got like an A on a paper or something. It was like a pretty dramatic moment. And he said, oh, if you like Shakespeare, you should read Keats. So I remember, because he said so, I went to the library and I got out this book, and there were a lot of long Keats poems in it, which I was nowhere near able to sit and read at that point. I didn't have a lot of patience. I read long novels, but like in Dimmy and
poems, yeah.
So I leafed through the book to the very end where they had this living hand, and I read it. And that probably is about when I memorized it, because it just, but because I think I wanted to know, as a writer, I was really fascinated by the idea that you could sort of make something feel like it emerged as an image like that.
Right.
Because that ending, here it is, I hold it towards you, is so immediate that, your mind actually kind of creates this hand. You really do. And, that was almost like a magic trick to me at that point. So I read that poem a lot, just trying to figure out how he did it, and I think it's that shortness, the measured, and then going to here it is, this kind of, and then the gesture.
See, here it is. Yeah. So, yeah.
And that feels very modern. I know I'm talking about an old poem, and I thought when you asked, well, there's so many contemporary poems I love right now. But
I'm really taken too by this is a poem, you wonder if he thought it would ever be seen or read, if he'd sort of kind of written it on the margins of a book. And somehow I'm also thinking about makes me think of Goya's last paintings, that were sort of uncovered after his death. Well, I think way after his death, were painted over. But basically, he basically just started painting the walls of the villa he was living in. And they were, kind of meditations on where his mind was at. Really, he knew he was dying, and sort of like his, in an interesting way, sort of a little glimpse into what his cosmology was like at that moment, or his.
I think writers, I think Keats in some ways was obsessed with the idea that they would not be found. I mean, he wrote on his tombstone, here, and I'm going to misquote it, I know, but here lies one whose name is written in water, which wasn't really, but I have a complicated sense, just imaginatively, that sort of both things were true to him. I think that he may have, writers always in some ways try to trick themselves into thinking, in order to write whatever you want, in some ways you sort of trick yourself into this idea that maybe nobody will ever have to see it. But at the same time, you're definitely in some ways determined to write your way to somebody. You know what I mean? Like, I think there's always that sense of there's somebody I'm going to reach, because that's how you talk, like I love that thing Osip Mandelstam said, where he said, and he really at the end did write poems, I bet, that we've never seen. Osip Mandelstam had disappeared in the Russian Gulag, But he said a poem is a message in a bottle, destination, anyone in the world. I mean, part of the real delight of poetry is that you do get to write across time, and you do get to write to anyone in the world. And it's a pretty low tech way of doing it. Like you could write it in the margins of a book. You know, I mean, think of the miracle that we even have Emily Dickinson's poems on those tiny little.
I was just thinking of. Well, I was thinking about. I was thinking. I've just been on this sort of rant for a while that, you know, the two main pillars of American poetry are both miraculous in their own way.
Exactly.
Whitman and Dickinson. No one would have chosen Whitman in his era to be known,
No.
you know, 200 years later or 200 plus years later. And certainly Dickinson, you know, who, if anything, that's, I mean, both of them are testaments to long, arduous efforts by groups of people to sort of keep their work alive and sort of in print. And in Dickinson's case, to actually, you know, put her work into print over time. Just this kind of long process.
So disposable, these little sheets of paper, these little strips. But it's sort of a testament to, though, at the same time, the audacity when you're recording words that seem really significant to you, like a matter, you know, like they were great poet, you know, that their poetry is indelible in a way. So if somebody reads it, they're going to notice it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a lot different than my grocery lists or a lot of things I doodle in my notebooks.
Right.
And I feel that when you're writing that, something like this living hand that seems so intentional and purely communicative. I mean, because even if you look, it's a pretty short poem, but even if you think about how much is past, is conveyed in this hand now warm and capable of earnest grasping, or earnest grappling, is that you know, that's a line that, you know, packs a lot into a remarkably short amount of time. You know, earnest grasping is an interesting phrase because earnest does a lot of work there.
Who uses earnest anymore?
True, but even then, it's a really efficient, compressed way of saying something about what we do with our lives. You know what I mean?
Right.
And also it's got a certain value judgment, not value judgment, but, you know, it's kind of like his defense of sincerity in a way. And so you could unpack it for a long time, I guess is what I'm trying to say. You can kind of say, oh yeah, he's kind of talking about the, you know, because I do think Keats did have the capacity probably to seem a little overly earnest and almost nerdy, you know, like really he was Mr. Truth Beauty with a capital B, you know, T and a capital B, and probably sometimes sophisticated people around him were like, you know what I mean? Like, he's so concerned about truth, beauty, oh my God, you know. But he was also somebody pushed by circumstances, which is another reason I thought it was interesting to read this poem now. Because in some respects, when you read, if you become a Keats devotee and you read much of him, and he didn't, you know, he wrote a lot, but he wrote it in a short time. He was somebody pushed by circumstances to grapple very young and quickly with a lot of really huge questions, you know, like what does life mean if it doesn't last very long? What is it to be good? What is it to cope with circumstances that might make you want to give up?
Well, you know, thanks for saying yes to this.
I'm delighted.
That was great. I certainly learned a lot about Keats, and I want to thank Sheila Black again for joining me in this online conversation. Next up is David Campos. David was in Fresno, California when I spoke with him The first poem that he actually chose to share was a poem by Andres Montoya. Unfortunately, because of the lockdown, he wasn't able to get to his books. They were in his office. I think we talked about this in the clip, but he ended up choosing another favorite poem of his, a poem by Louise Glück. So without further ado, I should say David is teaches. He's also a great, he has one really wonderful book, winner of the Andres Montoya Prize, titled Furious Dusk. Definitely check it out. And he's got a forthcoming book coming out from Red Hen Press in, I believe, 2021. So certainly something to put on your calendar. Anyway, here's David.
Hey, how's it going?
There we go. All right, we're recording, I think. Hi, David.
How's it going?
Pretty good. So you were telling me you had some difficulty finding the right poem, or
Right, because I spent most of last evening trying to find and trying to think of the poem, and I was just like, "Where's the book? Where's the book? Where's the book?" And I left it at work. I I have a good amount of bookshelves here at home, but I also have a huge kind of wall bookshelf at my office at work. But the campus is closed, and there's like a whole process just to get back on campus. If I wanted to go retrieve something, like I have to call the campus police, I have to notify my dean, they have to be there, I have to tell them how long I'm going to be there. Because a student was, and this happened last week, a student went to some kind of training. They came back to training, came on campus when they found out that the person who was training them during that period tested positive. And so because that student was in contact with someone who was positive and visited the campus, the entire campus just shut down.
Right.
And everyone in that building was asked to go into a 14-day quarantine. And it made getting that poem, once I realized, okay, that's the poem that I want to get, really difficult to get.
So do you know, is the poem available online?
That poem specifically, no, because I've looked for it many times before.
So what's the poem? Maybe we can at least shout it, call it out.
The Ice Worker Speaks of Endings by
Martin Espada.
No, Andres Montoya.
No, wait. No, what am I thinking of? I'm thinking of the Ice. Doesn't he also have one that's like? No, what am I thinking? Oh, well, that title sounds very much like. Oh, you're thinking of Andres Montoya's poem.
Yes, Andres Montoya's poem.
Yeah. I'm thinking of the Gravediggers. Is it a Gravediggers archaeology? It's just a number of.
Oh, that's William Archila.
Yeah, that's Sheila, and I want to say Espada also had like maybe one of his first books. There's something about like the Radiators, or anyway.
I don't know.
I'm not remembering.
I'm unfamiliar with it.
The Ice Worker Sings. Yeah, that's the one that was written. Wasn't that published after his death? Or yeah. Huh. Yeah. Well, so not having your first choice. What other poem? I don't know. What
did I find?
Think of. So, here's the first question.
Okay.
Are there any poems memorized?
I do not. I try to memorize them, but I think my mind is just. It's never been very good at memorizing poems or memorizing things. Like I tried to do plays before, and I'm just like, I keep forgetting lines. It's just never really worked for me.
Yeah, me neither. Well, I mean, there's one poem. I mean, I'm calling this podcast "Fish for Fallen Light." It's a line from one of Neruda's last poems. And I started reading that, I guess, right out of college. So that poem's kind of lived with me for a long time. And that's pretty much the only poem. I mean, I'm always impressed by people who can memorize poems. I'm always blown away by like performance poets that like can memorize. That just blows my mind.
Not just one poem, right? Like their entire set, right?
Everything.
And it's
that's
just
same thing with with actors, and I mean people who can. Yeah, I'm sure there's. I mean I'm sure that's like a muscle that's trained or something. But I've just never been able to do it personally. Yeah. So what do you want to share?
So the poem that I want to share is a poem that I read as an undergrad, a poem that I read as a graduate student, and the poem I've always returned to when I've encountered times of distress, and more specifically survival, right? Like I was thinking about all these different poems and I'm just like, oh shit, they're all about survival. Wait, okay. All right, that's starting to make sense. And it's from this book. Let me see if I can get it. Wild Iris. Yeah, absolutely. And the title of the poem is Witchgrass. So the poem looks like this. Let me see here.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. I love this poem.
Can you read it?
Absolutely. And so there are several ways that I've read this poem before, right? One where I pause after every line, and then one where I just read it like I read through the entire sentence.
Right.
So I'll just read it like I'm reading through the entire sentence, which I think is the way that I would typically read a poem. I only read it the other way when I'm studying a poem for its craft. So Witchgrass. Something comes into the world unwelcome, calling disorder, disorder. If you hate me so much, don't bother to give me a name. Do you need one more slur in your language? Another way to blame one tribe for everything? As we both know, if you worship one God, you only need one enemy. I'm not the enemy. Only a ruse to ignore what you see happening right here in this bed. A little paradigm of failure. One of your precious flowers dies here almost every day, and you can't rest until you attack the cause, meaning whatever is left, whatever happens to be sturdier than your personal passion. It was not meant to last forever in the real world. But why admit that? When you can go on doing what you always do, mourning and laying blame, always the two together. I don't need your praise to survive. I was here first. Before you were here. Before you ever planted a garden. And I'll be here when only the sun and moon are left, and the sea and the wide field. I will constitute the field.
Wow. I sort of want to like contemple that poem, just sort of begs for this kind of silence. I will constitute field.
The field. Like whatever the fuck you do, I will remain. I will take over this space. This is mine. And I kind of feel that way when I'm thinking about writing in general, right? Like even just approaching the page on a personal level, like there are so many things out there putting pressure for me not to write, right? And knowing that I will constitute this field, I will constitute this page, I will spread, if you will. I will outlive whatever those pressures are, even in those small little moments like that. I remember in a poem in my first book, I talk about driving all the way up to Fresno because I was in Riverside for a labor conference with my previous employer. So I took them to labor court, right? And there was a mediator there. And the entire time I got there really early. And the entire time I was reading that poem just over and over again. That's kind of like my personal mantra.
Yeah.
Before going in there, because just like no matter what they do to me, right? No matter what happens in that room, no matter what happens in that conference, I will still remain. I will still be me. I will survive this moment. I will survive this era, if you will.
It's a centering and grounding poem. You know?
Absolutely. And now that I think of it, it's kind of almost perfect for this moment, you know?
Yeah. It's funny. Two things that it sort of, brings up in me is, well, that last line, "that constitute the field," reminds me. It was a couple years ago. I was at Ragdale, it's a residency place north of Chicago, and they had this huge chunk of virgin prairie. It's like and totally untouched. I don't know how many, like hundreds of acres. It's behind this big house that you stay in. And I remember being totally blown away because I lived in Chicago for a couple of years, but that's in the city, and you think about sort of the Midwest and the prairie. And so, when you weren't riding or whatever, people would go for walks. And I remember, I think that was kind of one of the first places that I was at that I just, there was this other guy there, he's a visual artist. He's a muralist, kind of one of the old kind of movement muralists who had done a bunch of, social murals in South Chicago. Anyway, but he was also this kind of avid gardener, and he would take us for walks, or, I'd go on walks with him, and he'd be pointing out kind of, for me, it just looked like this big green, actually, no, that's not true. It was kind of late fall, so things were kind of dying out. But he was pointing out kind of specific like what was still flowering, kind of late in the season. Just all, he was actually letting me see what was actually in the prairie, and kind of realizing that this is the natural, this is what the world looks like naturally, when it's not all mowed down for crops and stuff. Anyway, and ever since then, I think about sort of, there's also this aspect too in the poem about kind of, what's the line in the poem about one God, one enemy? Like
it's if you worship one God, you only need one enemy.
Yeah, and this idea of simplifying things to their either binary, or this kind of a sense of this monoculture that like anything that doesn't fit is somehow and that
doesn't belong, right?
Yeah,
like, I'm not the enemy. I love that next line, right? I'm not the enemy.
Right. And there's a sense of, there's a line I've tried to sort of work into I think I worked in a poem, but not successfully. So I'm not sure if it's ever gonna, but it's this whole idea about like crop or prairie, it's like this idea of sort of kind of so much of our culture is about sort of just creating this monolithic one thing, I mean, that's so true of the way we like deal with identity, that we somehow want to just kind of simplify it down to totally suck out its, whatever specificity, is in the culture. And so the sense of sort of like, I will constitute, the idea of sort of like constituting this kind of universality of the idea of the prairie being not just one thing, but containing multitudes, to sort of echo Whitman there. But
no, that's what I was thinking that last line was an allusion to.
Yeah. And then the other piece, for some reason I was remembering, I can't remember who it was, but I remember reading something about, now I'm not going to remember who it was, but I remember reading something about the tradition of carrying was somebody who, in their office or at their home or on their altar, for people who sort of like, keep altars, they actually had a small little jar that had earth from, like, dirt from where they grew up. And it was this, especially, for those of us who, kind of don't live near where we grew up, this
Right.
sort of kind of remembering being grounded in this one place.
I know my dad has like artifacts that he has from his old town, right? And that's kind of the way that he holds on to that space.
Yeah,
For
like
example,
Manikia, right? Relics of yeah.
yeah. He has this old bill that belonged to his great grandfather, and it's the type of bill. It's a cowbell, and it's the type of bill that is the metal is folded, right? It's still in the time when it was folded. The metal was folded, so you could tell all the foldings.
So it'd have been
how it's
hammered or
like one
something?
sheet. Yeah.
Wow.
And so when someone is sick at my parents' house, right, they'll use the cowbell to like get somebody's attention, right, or because they can't speak or whatever the reason. And something interesting I found out was that cowbell was on my great grandfather's favorite cow called Concha, right? Unrelated, many years later, I get a dog. It's my pet. She's my doggy. And what do I name her? Not knowing any of this, I name her Concha.
That's hilarious.
I know, it's just a little bit of universe coincidence.
Well, that's a great poem, David. I'm sorry we didn't have
that first one,
but it's a hell of a second choice.
But I do remember the closing line of that original poem of The Ice Worker Speaks of Endings, because I almost got that last line tattooed.
Oh, really?
Yeah, as a tattoo. I chickened out at the last moment, and so
all right. So give us the title of the poem so people can go look it up.
It's The Ice Worker Speaks of Endings by Andres Montoya. And the closing line that I remember is, "Now, here and now, the clouds are opening into light."
That's nice. Now, here and now, the clouds are opening. The clouds are opening light. Is that
into light? Yeah.
Into light.
Yeah.
Right.
I love it. It's a great sense of hope.
Yeah. We need to certainly hold on to it.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks so much, David. It's been
Thank
really
you for
great
having me.
Stay safe. Keep writing. I'm curious. I've been asking everybody: Are you writing poetry in this?
No, I'm writing the
or not. Oh, I'm sorry. What are you writing?
I'm writing a novel.
Excellent.
Yeah, man.
Sweet. So, and then I've also been asking: is there anything you want to plug? Apparently,
anything I want
to podcast.
Anything I want to plug? Your local restaurants right now who need some help. Right? Like, do one of those curbside orders or do a DoorDash, right?
Yeah.
Do something.
Yeah, supporting local.
Yeah. I know, a few people in the service industry who lost their jobs. My students, I was calling them last week and they're just like, I don't know how I'm going to continue on this semester because of everything that's happened. I lost my job. Like, I can't pay the bills, right? Like, I can't pay for the things I would usually need to attend school and succeed and do well. And so that's what I'm plugging, support those local businesses, those places that support, those college age kids and people in your community.
Definitely. All right. Well, that's a good way to end. Thanks, David.
Hasta luego.
I want to thank David for that conversation about that wonderful Louise Glück poem. Folks, this is a experiment. I don't know how long it's going to go, or hopefully I'll get better at doing these. I want to apologize. I should have apologized at the first for any audio difficulties, technical difficulties, trying to do the best we can. Anyway, I also want to give a shout out, thank you to my husband, partner, Peter Montgomery, who sort of served as a guinea pig to help me check levels and sound quality. Just tried out a number of different ways of recording these conversations before we figured out which one would be the easiest, clearest one to use. Hopefully we will improve from here, but this is what we have. This is what we have to offer. I figured the best way to sort of close this first episode of Fish for Fallen Light was with a poem that inspired the title for this podcast. The title, Fish for Fallen Light, is a line from one of my favorite poems, perhaps my favorite poem. It's an untitled poem by Pablo Neruda. Neruda was, he kind of wrote it towards the end of his life. It's one of his, last poems he wrote, much like the Keats poem that we talked earlier with Sheila Black about. Neruda was dying in Chile of stomach cancer. He had just come back from Chile. He was living in France as the Chilean ambassador to France. And all of a sudden, he got this diagnosis and moved back to Chile and was living in Isla Negra along the coast, one of his favorite places, in a house that he had designed himself. Anyway, he worked on 5 books. He left 5 books that were published after his death. And in one of them, Mari las Campanas, Seeing the Bells, there's this wonderful little untitled poem that absolutely shattered me when I first read it. And it's lived with me. My relationship with the poem has changed over time. It's continued to speak to me and to reveal new dimensions over the years. So this is the entitled poem this podcast is named after. If each day falls inside each night, there exists a well where clarity lies imprisoned. We must sit at the rim of the well of darkness and fish for fallen light with patience. I hope you enjoyed this first installment. I've had a couple of other conversations and hope to get those up as soon as possible. I know we are all living in a surreal period, a fraught period, a dangerous period, thick times, as I like to say. And it's good to have ways of reaching out to one another. So I hope wherever you are, I hope you know you're not alone in going through this, and seek those things out that can give you some comfort. For me, it's friends and family as I can reach them, and poetry. So until the next one, keep fishing. Is that a good send off? Okay. Later. Bye.